Today, we're going to discuss how AI is becoming safer. One of the things that's driving me and driving this channel is the huge intersection between cybersecurity and generative AI. And one of the big reasons why I'm so interested in that is actually because of my background, as in because of some of the jobs that I've had. So, most of my career so far has been in tech. And with companies that do a lot of data science in one way or another and do a lot of analysis and algorithms and whatnot. And when you work with companies that are serious about data governance and ethics, you quickly learn that bad data leads to bad results, and bad algorithms or poor algorithms also lead to bad results. This kind of backdrop frames what is, for me, one of the core cybersecurity problems with LLMs, or maybe not problem, but the challenge. You see, LLMs are a giant black box, right? They're black boxes in so many layers where the data is abstracted from you. The algorithms are abstracted from you. The way it answers questions, I suppose that's kind of the algorithms, are abstracted to you. And to the point where repeatability and predictability can be kind of challenging to get with generative AI, right? That's kind of the bargain that you get with such a creative system. But that also creates this huge amount of question marks when you start to use this in production and for answering real questions. See, in all of the businesses that I work in, or I've worked in, data privacy and what can happen, what are the outputs and the outcomes of it, of a piece of analysis or a piece of science, are really important. And one of the things that surfaces all the time is bias. Could somebody, make a judgment about somebody that is incorrect based on one of our algorithms? Could we sell something incorrect or not offer something or whatever? And the reality is that bias can get injected at so many different layers. And like I just said, LLMs kind of black box all of that, and you have so little control over it. And that's kind of, that's maybe foundational to why I'm so interested in this, because from a use case, there is this big question mark. The other thing is there are, of course, actual just security risks, right? So LLMs can be prompt injected. You can confuse them. You can social engineer an LLM, which is weird to think of, but you can trick it to do things that you want it to do. This isn't like normal hacking per se. This is just language, the same way that you would attempt to trick a person, right? But also there's other layers to it, right? You can poison the data that the LLM is using. So maybe like in your organization, you're using some kind of RAG, some kind of retrieval augmented generation, but your RAG sources have been poisoned, but you won't be able to tell because, if you don't set up a good architecture, the LLM will just spit out stuff. What about data that is already existing in the LLM? How do you know that data hasn't already been poisoned? A lot of the data that's in these things are potentially scraped from the web, and potentially those sources are embedded. So, there's a certain degree of you don't know, and bias, or, well, frankly, anything can live in that data, but not just bias. So there is generally a big question mark about that. So this is why I'm excited to share with you some of the stuff that's been happening this week, and some of the news, because I think there are some really good steps, or at least I've seen some really good steps now about actually making generative AI safer and more secure. Practical steps, which I think is the most important thing. So this week I went to Bletchley Park. Bletchley Park is the place where the World War II codebreakers in England started breaking some of the German codes. And this is, where Alan Turing worked. So this kind of home of computing and maybe some of the original ideas behind AI is where I went for this conference. I was kind of a bit mind blown by it. I didn't actually get to see the exhibit, which is such a shame because the conference just kind of took me until the museum closed, but this is cool. Anyways, I digress. So I went here to Bletchley Park to this conference called Engineering Trustworthy AI. It was put on by an organization called TechWorks, which is kind of like an industry organization. And it features lots of speakers from everywhere in the country and people outside of the country, speakers and entities. So people from Oxford University, Bristol University, people from Amazon, there are people from BAE Systems, and also from UK government, so like UK's Department for Science and Innovation, and a lot more. There are people from all over it. So there were two things that really came out of that I really liked and I really want to share. The first one, which was one of the early discussions, was about engineering trustworthiness into, this is what the day was about, but was about some really specific actions. And there's a couple talks that touched on this about bill of materials. But before we get there, one of the early talks, Dr. Nicholas Allett gave, he mentioned something which is like, maybe we shouldn't call it trustworthiness. Maybe we should call it trustability. This is something I really agree with. Because the problem with LLMs is all that complexity. The risk of an LLM is, as he said, the sum of its parts. That's something I strongly believe and align with. You may or may not have seen my Madness series that I wrote. If not, take a look at this. But that is all about how I approach security from a systemic point of view for an organization. And I basically argue the same things. Like, you want to understand security, you want to understand how your organization is secure, then you need to understand all of the parts and to some degree the components that make up your applications and your assets, and then you will get a real picture of your risks. The same thing with an LLM. Of course, there's a lot of complexity there. And this is where this whole bill of material things, that concept comes in. So this is really borrowed from something that was already happening in the application security space and also in the supplier security space. And it's basically, as a bill of material sounds like, taking all of the ingredients and listing all of those ingredients to whatever you're building. So classically in software, you're talking about the libraries, you're talking about maybe inclusions, imports, whatever functions that you've used, maybe some kind of particular versions of packages or whatever. This is the kind of thing that you're talking about when you're doing an SBOM, which is something existing in the industry for a while. Now with an AI bomb, you're doing something similar, right? But you're including stuff like maybe the data set, origination about that, attestations about the weights, maybe the fine tune of that, dependencies as to what other models like were needed. Let's say you fine tune a previously existing model, all of this would go into this AI bomb this AI bomb bill of materials. So that's really critical, because really when it comes to using these AI systems, you really want to identify what problems you might have. And to identify that, you need to find what, the upstream problems are, like what has come, what have you inherited, which is the idea of bill of materials. Of course, the thing is, that declaration doesn't make it trustworthy. Going back to Dr. Allett's point, it just makes it trustable, right? Because you can now make a judgment about, well, do you mistrust those components, or are you okay with those components? Do you mistrust the group that's put out the model, or are you okay with that group? So it gives you a little bit more fact-based evidence or data to go with when you're trying to integrate one of these models. Of course, I should say that the concept of bill of materials is not about, giving away all of the secret sauce. In fact, one of the, I forget if it was Dr. Allett or for somebody else, this is about ingredients, right? And while I just said secret sauce, frankly, in a kitchen, even if you have a secret ingredient, you need a recipe. Not only do you need a recipe, but you need practice and know-how. And in some cases, you might need specific tools. I don't know if you guys ever watch any like Master Chef or cooking tools or whatever, or sorry, cooking shows. But some of these guys have stuff that is not in your average kitchen. Not everyone has a sous vide. No, everyone has a blast freezer. And these things can really change a process. So when we're talking about this bill of materials, we are not talking about how do you make this model. We're talking about what are the components of the model, right? And that's a really important distinction, and why I think this should really get more and more traction. The other thing that was along those lines was the idea of model cards. And this is, model cards already exist when you look at things like Hugging Face, but they're fairly non-standardized. There are some standards that exist, but the proposals that were at this conference, at the Engineering Trustworthiness in AI, specifically were from the Department for Science and Innovation and Technology, from a UK department. And that was about standardizing model cards, and quite possibly including some of this information, some of these AI bill of materials, AI bombs. So I think that's also a really cool initiative, because then it gives people a bit more of a level playing field, if at the very least in the UK, about how they can talk about these models and make choices about them. So I thought that was really cool. So look out for this stuff. Check out the TechWorks TIE bomb, TechWorks AI bomb, this tiebomb.org. I think that's really interesting. Also check out the AI bomb Tiger Team, so their GitHub repo. So those are two different takes. And then you should check out Model Cards Plus from the Department for Science, Innovation and Technology. That's not released yet. I think the government said that they're looking March, April, but watch that space. One of the other exciting things is that there's now more standards and frameworks coming out that can be used practically within projects. And that for me is a really good thing. It's cool to explore what you can do and to kind of like think about the stuff theoretically, but at some point you need to start getting to brass tacks, like how do you really secure this? So this is where this is quite fascinating for me. So a few things that I noted out from this conference, and actually some stuff that came out that I found out on LinkedIn before from some of my contacts, is first, this TechWorks AI best practice guide. I think that's really cool. It's pretty focused on the functional requirements, the functional, like basically the how, when, where do you use AI, and like how do you go about that project. So I think that's really useful if you're trying to think maybe critically about if you should be using AI and like how to adopt it. One of the other projects, which I love, is OWASP's top 10 for large language models. Now, if you've never heard about OWASP has been an open charity, open source organization that has created the OWASP top 10 and a lot of other material really focused on web application security. It is the Open Web Application Security Project. And it's one of the core industry pieces about how you secure applications. So now they've created their top 10 for LLMs for generative AI, which is also really useful. So very focused on attack vectors and vulnerabilities, but again, something really practical and gives you a way to really start thinking about the security threats specifically for generative AI. Interestingly enough, a lot of them are carried over from application security, but sometimes kind of like obfuscated because of the new problem space. There's also ISO 42001. Now, to be fair, I didn't actually hear about this from this particular conference, but rather from one of my contacts on LinkedIn, Svein Bekkevold, who posted about this, and I was like, oh, this is great. So for those of you who don't know what this is, ISO is famous for lots of standards around the world. They're international standards. ISO 9001 is something some people might be familiar with in a number of businesses. I'm very familiar with ISO 27001, which is all around security governance and creating a proper information security management system. It's pretty holistic and all-encompassing with the context of your organization. Now, I haven't gone into ISO 42001, but if it's anything like ISO 27001, I expect for it to cover the same kind of breadth. So looking at your AI use cases and processes, but within the greater context of your organization. So I think that's going to be pretty interesting, and I'm looking forward to getting into that. Of course, there's also the EU AI Act, which is a regulation that's really focused on the governance and the use cases, maybe the allowable use cases and the not allowable use cases for AI, specifically within the EU. And I think, looking at early versions of the EU AI Act, it was, specific things like don't use AI where you're making decisions that could really affect people's lives and their outcomes, and how much money they might have or stuff like that. So that's also a pretty interesting act and set a framework to look into, which is obviously regulation. Well, not in the UK technically, but regulation in Europe. So what do you think? Are you hyped to see all of this real world guidance and these real frameworks come out that might help us to actually practically secure AI? I certainly am. But yeah, what about you? What do you think about all this? Also, is there anything that you would like to discuss further? Is there anything that you would like me to cover and go deeper into? Let me know in the comments. Until then, bye-bye.